Okay, sleepy little Tiberius and I are back for another 10-minute talk. This time we're going to talk about tapering. Uh, Coming up to the beginning of the race season, I'm actually in a bit of a taper myself for the start of the crit and also triathlon season. Now, a taper, if you're not kind of aware of really what it is, it's basically you have a period of training of overload, and then you systematically drop your training volume so that you freshen up and you're ready to go when it comes to race day. Um, it's more of a art than a science, although there is a lot of science behind it. Don't get me wrong. So I was reading a piece of macro research before kind of putting this together, and basically what that was saying was that there are some specifics when it comes to tapering, and I'll just run through a handful of them and just some tips on practical application. So as I say, tapering, you need to have a pre-taper period of overload training. Like I say, it's not just something that you just sort of start relaxing and you're ready race ready. You actually have to do the training first. So yeah, you tend to have a period where you build up a lot of fatigue, a lot of hard training, race preparation, and then you go into a taper. It should be less than 21 days, which I think, yeah, that probably seems pretty commonsensical. Anything more than that, and you're just detraining basically. So yeah, getting ill or what have you is not necessarily a taper. In terms of practicalities, you want to reduce your overall volume by about 40 to 60% during the taper period. And that's from the kind of the previous week. So that's from the overload period where your training is kind of at its peak. And now, probably the most crucial aspect of tapering, and something that I think a lot of uncoached athletes, and maybe some coaches as well, don't get 100% right, is that you have to maintain frequency and intensity. And intensity is the really important one. Frequency, I've found that you can actually sometimes when you apply it to an athlete's life in reality, the frequency has to go in order to drop the volume properly, particularly if somebody's working 5 days a week. But the intensity has to stay there because there's, I think, a bit of a nuance in the language. You're not really looking to get well rested. You're looking to be sharp, and there is a nuance there if you look for it. But basically, having 4 or 5 days rest before a race will make you well rested, but it's not going to make you sharp. And one of the key reasons for that is recycling glycogen in your muscles. So glycogen is the storage form of glucose, and basically, if it sits in your muscles for too long and isn't recycled, isn't constantly kind of replaced and removed, um, it leaves you feeling very kind of sluggish and yeah, just a little bit off par. And I've experienced this in races before. We actually had an athlete recently who experienced this due to picking up a bit of an injury a couple of weeks out before a marathon. And then they were just saying, like, right from the gun, they felt sluggish. They felt, and it's because they hadn't maintained intensity during that kind of 2 week period where they were actually just having to stay off their feet. And that's no criticism, by the way. That's just the reality of their situation. So you must maintain intensity. For me, that's probably the most important aspect, my most important takeaway. I think slashing volume is quite straightforward, and we all understand that it needs to be the case. But maintaining intensity, that's what not everybody gets right. And then in terms of practical application, that's why I say it's more of an art than a science sometimes, because it is incredibly personal. It depends on the event you're doing. It depends on whether it's, a particular event or if it starts the season. It also depends on kind of what your life is like. And I'll just kind of run through a couple more specifics. But so the length of the event is important as to how long the taper is. So, for instance, you would probably take a longer taper for something like an Ironman, something you spend a long time and have had a really high volume of training. You probably need a longer taper to deal with that really high volume of training and kind of flush that out the system. So maybe like 2 weeks as opposed to one. Um, and you know, if you can switch that to maybe like the start of the crit season, like I'm only on a 1 week taper because I need to try and carry my form for longer. And if I have a longer taper, then it just means that, you know, I'm on very much a more aggressive downward slope. So I need to kind of just hold on to that a little bit longer. So my taper is a little bit shorter for, you know, an event which is up to an hour, depending on what I'm doing. Oh, he's had enough of me talking. And as I say, it also depends whether you're doing a single event or a season. You know, single event, you can be a little bit more kind of specific and a little bit more dogged in it. Whereas when it comes to preparing for a season, there are complications to it. It's not as straightforward, and it perhaps wouldn't be as aggressive in terms of reduction of volume. And then also something you've got to consider is how many times you're going to taper, how many times you're going to peak in a season. Strictly speaking, I think you're kind of looking 2 or 3 times a season, depending on how long your season is. And it needs to be a pretty big gap in between them because you have to have that overload period of training. And so if you follow something like cyclocross, which has a very defined season structure, about halfway through the season, a lot of them will disappear and go off to Spain for a couple of weeks. And it's because as they're going through the season, because they can't maintain the same volume of training, their performance actually drops off. And so they have a period of training where they go away, do a heavy load, and then taper into kind of like the second part of the season, or, you know, tends to be when the major championships are. So you've got to be specific in how many times. So you have to really be clear in your mind as to what are your big goals for the season, which are your key events. And then probably one of the most important factors is your lifestyle. So when you drop into a taper, it's lovely because you go from kind of training being your life to then suddenly having all this extra capacity. And it's really important in that period that you don't fill up that extra capacity with other stuff. And this is where life and your lifestyle becomes determinative. Because I remember tapering for a marathon once, and I was loving not having to do much training. But in that period, work went insane, and I actually got to the marathon absolutely knackered because other stuff took over, lots of stress, etc. So there's only so much you can manage, but if you can, during that taper, avoid filling it with other stuff if you can. As I say, not always that simple, and sometimes that does actually impact the length of your taper. If you have a really busy job, sometimes you need a week rather than 2 because you actually can't hold back for that much. So yeah, these are just some of the factors to consider, and that's why it becomes a bit of an art. There are other just really personal factors. So some people just do not do well with a long taper. So I was probably put myself in that sort of category. You know, tapering for Ironman, I remember one occasion I took quite a long taper, full 2 week taper, and it just didn't work for me. Yeah, it just didn't work. I can't, there's no real rhyme or reason there, but I just didn't feel great on race day. Did everything else perfectly, or at least I thought I did. But yeah, the kind of the one standout factor for me that was different about that taper was the length of it. So yeah, a number of different factors, and unfortunately some of these only kind of get borne out by experience. But hopefully there's some at least practical points there that you can employ, dropping your volume from your peak by about 40 to 60% during the taper. So it is a progressive taper, it's not sunny slash. Maintain frequency, but most importantly, maintain intensity so you're race sharp rather than just well rested.